Okay, so welcome again to Mayim Chayim Beit Midrash. This is session 10 of our Joshua overview, and I'm going to do something I've never done before in the history of my teaching ministry, and that's cover basically 7 chapters in one night. But we're not going to really cover all of the chapters, obviously. We're just going to highlight certain aspects, as I promised I was going to do earlier in the study, that it was going to be a survey, not a verse-by-verse teaching. And that's I'm going to be true to, because these chapters here, I'm only going to choose to highlight certain elements of them that I felt would be interesting, that are also in context with the rest of what we've been doing in the book. Whereas to me, a lot of the real power of the book is found in the first 8 to 10 chapters and then in the final few chapters. So next week might be the last study in Joshua. Oh, okay. So Lorna's not going to make it. I just got a message from Lorna. No problem. I'll let her know. Thank you for the message. So it might just be a few of us here tonight. It might be a real small class, but that's fine. So like I was saying, next week might be the last class for Joshua. I have my friend Drake lined up to do a presentation of one of the research projects he's been doing that he's excited about. And I haven't decided yet if I'm going to do Drake as part of the live class or if I'm going to record him offline and then just post it in the group. We'll have to see what the content is. I got to preview it first. But he usually has some very interesting stuff that he does. And it might be very interesting as an interlude before we go back into Derech Hashem. But at any rate, we're going to pick up in Joshua here in chapter 13. So we ended at the end of chapter 11 last week, and we're going to skip all of chapter 12, and we're going to pick up in chapter 13. And I'm going to go ahead and get to the section that we're dealing with here. We're going to talk about Balaam for a little bit here. We're going to have some Talmud and some commentary on Balaam, which I thought would be very interesting, because Balaam shows up here in the text when we get to chapter 13. It says, if we get down to verse 22, as it's describing all these conquered areas, it says, also Balaam the son of Beor, the soothsayer, did the children of Israel slay with the sword, together with those who were slain by them. So that's interesting because, of course, we saw in the Torah portion a couple of weeks ago how Balaam shows up in the book of Numbers, and he gets enticed by Balak, one of the kings of Canaan, to invoke curses against Israel. And Balaam has this big pomp and circumstance telling Balak that, only the words of the Lord God may I speak. And instead of declaring curses on Israel, he declares blessings. But we do know, because of this passage here in Joshua, that Balaam's end is not good. And the reason why his end is not good is that he enticed the hind parts of Israel to enter into wickedness with the daughters of the land, and committed lewdness and defiled the nation. And as a result of this, because Balaam took his considerable gifts, in fact, the Jewish people say that Balaam's prophetic talents were on a par with Moses, that he was the Moses of the nations. And yet he used his power in his gifting to try to curse Israel rather than trying to bless the nations and uphold Israel, which was his job. And so because he violated his purpose for his gifting, he ends up dying by the sword in battle, and we see that recorded here in Joshua. So there's going to be quite a bit of commentary we're going to look at with that. One of the things we're going to see with Balaam is that he's referred to here in Joshua, instead of as a prophet, he's referred to as a soothsayer. And the Talmud actually explains why. It gives us an explanation as to what's going on here, and I thought it was interesting, and I wanted to share it with you. So in Talmud Tractate Bava Batra 15b, we have the following, which it talks about Balaam and his father. First off, it says that Tosafot, which is a collection of rabbis who commentated on the Talmud in the Middle Ages, explains that this phrase is based on the principle that whenever a prophet's father is named, it means that he too, meaning the father, also had prophetic abilities. Therefore, it can be understood that Balaam's father was also a prophet. But the Gemara, it says, raises an objection from another Bereda against the notion that Job was a Jew. So this conversation it's having about Job. There's this big, long conversation in the Talmud about, was Job of the nations, was he a Noahide, or was he actually Jewish? And so as we pick up this conversation here in Bava Basra 15, it says 7 prophets prophesied to the nations of the world. And they are Balaam and his father Beor, and Job, Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, and Elihu bar Barachel the Buzite, which indicates that Job was not Jewish. He said to him, and according to your reasoning that Job could not have been Jewish because he prophesied to the nations of the world, was Elihu ben Barachel not a Jew? Is it not written of the family of Ram, Job 32:2, meaning Avraham? Rather, one must explain that Elihu is included in this list because he prophesied to the nations of the world, and so too it may be maintained that Job is included in this list, even though he is Jewish, because he prophesied to the nations of the world. The Gemara asks, but did not all the other prophets also prophesy to the nations of the world? Why then are only these 7 mentioned? The Gemara answers, there with regard to the other prophets, their main prophecies were directed to Israel, whereas here, with regard to these 7 prophets, their main prophecies were directed to the nations of the world. So again, you see that Balaam's gifting from God was meant to bring illumination to the nations. He was not supposed to be using his giftings from God, which were very significant, in order to bring forth cursings against God's people. And that's something I think is an interesting parallel, because you see this a lot of times. You see people who are in the church who have obviously been gifted with talents and abilities to teach and exhort and all these other things, and yet they use those gifts for other reasons than what they're intended for. Hi, Kevin. And it's an interesting point, and I think it's a lesson that you can't come against God's chosen people without there being a bad end. It's just not, whether you think you're theologically justified or not. Anytime you have an attack against the Jewish people or Lashon Hara against the Jewish people, for whatever the reasons are, whether you think it's justified or not, any kind of a misportrayal of God's people that shames them or humiliates them or hurts them before the nations or in their experience is going to eventually come back on you in a major way. And Balaam loses his life over it. He thinks he's being clever. He thinks he's compromising somehow with God's prophecy to try to win back the favor of Balak. But in the end, he makes a really bad choice and he dies by the sword. So it's not worth it. We're also going to look at another tractate, Sanhedrin 106a, if you're taking notes. It's Sanhedrin 106a into 106b. Not a super long passage. I'm going to read this to you. It says, with regard to Balaam, it is stated, and they slew the kings of Midian with the rest of their slain, and Balaam, son of Beor, they slew with the sword, Numbers 31:8. And the Gemara asks, Balaam, what did he seek there? What was his role in that war? He lived in Aram. Rabbi Yochanan says that he went to collect payment for 24,000 members of the Jewish people, whom he felled with his advice. This is referring to what I was just talking about. Mar Zutra Bar Tovia says that Rav says that this is in accordance with the adage that people say, a camel goes to seek horns, and the ears that it had are severed from it. Not only was Balaam unsuccessful in collecting his fee, he also lost his life. And it is stated, and Balaam, son of Beor, the diviner, did the children of Israel slay with the sword among the rest of their slain, referring to Joshua 13:22, our passage here. The Gemara asks, was he a diviner? He is a prophet. Rabbi Yochanan says, initially he was a prophet, but ultimately he lost his capacity for prophecy and remained merely a diviner, which is a lower status. Rav Papa says that this is in accordance with the adage that people say this woman was descended from princes and rulers and was licentious with carpenters. So that's an interesting statement. And then it goes on in 106b, it says, with regard to the latter part of the verse, and Balaam, son of Beor, the diviner, did the children of Israel slay with the sword among the rest of their slain. Joshua 13:22. Rav says, it means that they accomplished in him all four means of court-imposed executions, meaning they accomplished upon him stoning, burning, beheading, and also strangulation, which are the three methods of the death penalty as prescribed in the Torah. A certain heretic said to Rabbi Hanina, have you heard how old Balaam was when he died? Rabbi Hanina said to him, it is not written explicitly in the Torah, but from the fact that it is written, bloody and deceitful men shall not live half their days, this indicates that he was 32 to 34 years old. Isn't that interesting? Less than half the standard 70-year lifespan. The heretic said to him, you have spoken well. I myself saw the notebook of Balaam, and it was written therein, Balaam the lame was 32 years old when Phinehas, the highwayman, killed him. Mar, son of Ravina, said to his son, with regard to all of those enumerated as not having a share in the world to come, do not extensively interpret verses homiletically in order to denigrate them, except with regard to Balaam the wicked. As any negative element that you discover in this regard, continue to interpret homiletically concerning him, as it is appropriate to attribute wickedness to one so wicked. So I think it's interesting just to highlight again that it says in Psalm 55:24, bloody and deceitful men shall not live half their days. And this indicates that he must have died when he was in his mid-30s. Okay. Doesn't mean that everyone who dies in their mid-30s is bloody and deceitful, but I just think it's interesting how the Gemara analyzes this. So, excuse me. Anyways, so Rashi goes on, and Rashi says in his commentary that Balaam had usurped Israel's power of the tongue. I was alluding to this a few minutes ago, which is meant to be manifested through prayer and prophecy. So Phinehas, who tradition says slew Balaam in this war, he slew Balaam with the weapon of Esau, which is the sword. So it's interesting because, of course, this is very Kabbalistic, this concept that the strength of Esau is the might of arms, whereas the strength of Jacob is the one who dwells in tents and studies. So the idea of the power of Judah, of Jacob, the power of Jacob, the power of Israel, is the power of the proclamation of the revelation of God. But the power of this and the strength of Esau, that which turns against Israel, is always the power of force. So it's very, very interesting because, for the last 2,000 years, for instance, we've had basically the power of Esau has ruled, and Israel has had to dwell in the tents of Esau, because Western culture largely is Roman. It's Roman influenced. The United States of America is largely based on Plato's Republic. It's based upon the concepts and ethics of Stoicism and Roman triumphalism, and that's what it's based on, and that's what Christianity is also based on. Western culture has grown on the wings of Roman power, with the religious structure of Christianity upholding it. Whereas the Jewish people have had to labor in massive persecution throughout these many centuries, struggling just to survive, not able to fulfill their true calling of to be a light to the nations, because they've been getting subjugated by the nations. That's always the root of anti-Semitism, is always to subjugate the Jewish voice with force. It's always how it goes. So you slander them so that you can inspire people to take up arms against them. Nowadays it's Islam, but for many centuries it was Christianity fulfilling what today is being fulfilled by Islam. Many Christians today are completely disgusted with Islam, radical Islam, not recognizing the very real fact that Islam today, radical Islam today, represents what the church represented for many, many centuries. In fact, Islam has quite a ways to go to catch up to what the church has accomplished in that regard. So Christians should not be so quick to throw stones at Islam when they're really just looking at a mirror. All right, so moving on to verse 33 of chapter 13. We're going to skip ahead about 11 verses. And we're going to look at an aspect of inheritance. We get to the end of chapter 13, and it says, "But to the tribe of Levi, Moses gave no inheritance. The Lord God of Israel was their inheritance, as he spoke to them." This is a concept that carries through Jewish ethics, and it finds itself a home and a purchase in the narrative of the New Testament. The New Testament, as we read it, the way it's written, we have this notion that gets spouted that our inheritance is somehow not here, but it's somehow somewhere else. It's in God. It's not, and that's a nice thought. It's not an untrue thought, but it can be taken too far. But this idea actually comes from the Old Testament, what Christians call the Old Testament. It comes from the Tanakh. This idea that the tribe of Levi is not really given a physical inheritance in the land. They have a partial inheritance among all the tribes, because they have the service of the house, the service of the tabernacle. And so they serve the people in that capacity, and the people are meant to uphold the Levites and support them as they do that work. That's actually the entire biblical precedent for ministers being paid to do their work of ministry by the people, so that they can be free from other obligations that prevent them from walking that out in their full measure. So regarding this verse, it's interesting that the inheritance of the Levites and the priesthood is the service of the tabernacle. However, there's an interesting part of Jewish law, which is cited by the Rambam in Laws of Shemitah. The Rambam states that, however, according to Jewish law, if any land is annexed to Israel beyond the prescribed borders already established, that the Levites are entitled to a share of that land. So it's not really true that Levites don't have any inheritance in the land. The truth of the matter is that they do get land if Israel were to expand its borders. So since we know that in the concepts of the Messianic age to come, that there's going to be an expansion of the tent of Jerusalem, to be able to include all the members of the nations who draw near, that we would see from the Laws of Shemitah in the Rambam, because Shemitah is a very messianic concept, that the Levites are actually going to inherit land outside the scope of the traditional borders of Israel as a result of the expansion of its borders, which is a promise in the Messianic age. It's a very interesting idea. So we're going to move on again, just kind of speeding through here, to verse 63 of of chapter 13. Oh, I went too far. Hold on. Oh no, I'm sorry. Verse 63 of chapter 15. That's why I can't find it. There is no verse 63 of chapter 13. So we go to chapter 15, 63, if you're going to be following along here. And we're skipping some text. Making good time here. And I went past it again. Just want to make sure I have my space marked. Well, I'll just read the verse because I'm having a hard time finding it in the commentary. But the verse says, "As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. But the Jebusites dwelt with the children of Judah at Jerusalem to this day." So this is very, very interesting. By the way, we're going to go back to the idea of the Levites and their inheritance as we get to the end of the study. We're going to look at some other reasons why the Levites don't inherit land. But for now, let's look at this. "As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out, but the Jebusites dwelt with the children of Judah at Jerusalem to this day." So remember, I said that the southern campaign went smooth as butter for the most part, with the exception of the sin of Achan, which resulted in the tragedy at Ai. Once they overcame that and conquered Ai, basically the entire southern kingdom fell into their lap. I mean, it just fell like dominoes, and the Lord fought for them, and everything just went very, very smoothly. But as they go to try to gain inheritance of the northern portions of the land and the other outer reaches, they run into some further complications. And one of the biggest complications they ran into, no surprise, is at Jerusalem itself. So right at the heart of Israel, we have this problem where Israel is not able to drive out the inhabitants. Now that sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? So we look at modern Israel today, and we see that, well, gee, what's with the controversy and the conflict in Jerusalem? Everybody wants to have a piece of the rock. Everybody wants to claim their piece of what they think is rightfully theirs. And so, you know, those of us who are in favor of a fulfillment of the biblical narrative of the inheritance of Abraham, we shake our heads in derision at the other people groups that want to claim this area. And those other people groups who are not pro-Israel, they shake their heads at Israel and say, oh, they're prosecuting us, they're oppressing us, and everything else. But the reality is that it doesn't represent anything that hasn't always been. You know, there's never really been a time, except in the zenith of David and Solomon's reign, there's never really been a time when Israel, and Jerusalem specifically, was not contested by someone. And even here at the establishment of Israel in the Promised Land, as they're conquering the land for the first time, we find this passage here in chapter 15 where the Jebusites cannot be driven out of Jerusalem, which is going to become the city of David. It's not that yet. At the initial phases of Israel's occupation of Canaan, we don't find Jerusalem as the city that it is today. It wasn't that yet. We're going to explain that. But it's just fascinating to me that they couldn't drive the inhabitants out of Jerusalem. In fact, there's some commentary on this. It says Rabbi Joshua, the son of Korba, says they really could have driven them out. This is very interesting. But they were not permitted to do so. Why? Because of the oath which Abraham had sworn to Abimelech. This goes all the way back to Genesis 21:23. If you remember the scene, Abraham is looking for a place to bury Sarah, his deceased wife. Now, Abraham knows that the entire land has been given to him by promise, by God. And yet Abraham acknowledges the status of the current situation in the land, where basically Abimelech, they have kind of squatters' rights on the land. Even though Abraham has been given a promise, Abimelech has physical possession. So what does Abraham do? He purchases a cave that has already been granted to him by promise. He goes through the work of purchasing it legally so that he has a place to bury his wife. And now we read in the commentaries here that it's because of this transaction that goes on between Abraham and Abimelech that they actually don't have the legal moral right to force the Jebusites out. Very interesting. Why? Because they made a covenant with Abimelech. And of course, in that passage, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but Abimelech is not really a name of a person. It's a title of an office. So Abimelech was a chieftain, a major chieftain. It's a title. So now it says in the commentary that the Jebusites were not of the Jebusite nation, but the Tower of David, which was in Jerusalem, so the tower was already there, and the inhabitants of that section were of the Philistines. So it was the Philistines actually that were occupying the Tower of David. Even though it was in the name of the Jebusites, it was the Philistines that really were controlling things behind the scenes there. So we have this conflict that has some mitigating factors to it. It's not as simple and as cut and dry as you would like to think, as many things often are. In fact, we have this complex relationship where Israel has an obligation to one people group, but behind the scenes there's a manipulating influence which is nefarious towards Israel, which is actually pulling strings behind the scene to where Israel can't really get to the root of the problem because they're being shielded by a people that they have a covenant relationship with. Again, it reminds me of modern Israel. Many times, particularly evangelical Christians will look at Israel and they'll be so negative towards the Palestinians. But it isn't the Palestinians that are the problem. The problem is the wicked leadership that manipulates the Palestinians into being portrayed as being in the midst of this conflict that's being created by other forces. The Palestinian people themselves mostly are innocent. It's the leadership. And in many ways, also, the leadership of Israel also is culpable in many different ways that many evangelicals don't know. It's not a simplistic situation over there. I don't fully understand it, but as I learn of it, and I learn about the complexities of it, it's something way beyond the grasp of the average Facebook post that we see get touted around. In fact, my Breslover rabbi, Rabbi Siegel, has actually gone out of his way to say that he will not entertain any posts from websites such as Breaking Israel News and One for Israel and any of these kind of posts, especially One for Israel. Breaking Israel News, he says, is a propaganda organization that do not portray actual truth. So you got to be careful the news you get through Facebook. Our sensitivities and our biases sometimes can lead us to just like something without really knowing what's really going on. Anyways, that's on the side. That's not really the point I'm trying to make. But what we have here in Jerusalem in the days of the conquest of Israel is a similar type complexity, and it's complex right around the city of Jerusalem. And Rashi is the one that's making this commentary. So what happens in that case is Joshua chooses an interesting course of action. Is because of the complexity of the situation, rather than launching a military campaign against the inhabitants of Jerusalem and wiping them out and pushing them out of the city, Joshua chooses a path of peaceful coexistence, particularly because of this issue with Abraham. So it's interesting that you would think that because of the covenant that Joshua would have an incentive to all the more so in Jerusalem be violent and aggressive. But yet in reality, it's because of covenant that he restrains himself. And it's an interesting lesson for us. Sometimes we think we see a clear path, but this is what's right, this is what needs to happen. Why don't we move forward? Well, there's other factors involved. There's other people involved. There's other considerations. You know, these are some of the kind of things we're going to get into when we get back into the Derek Hashem, when we start looking at section 2, we start looking at divine providence and supervision. These are all issues that we have to understand at some level if we're going to understand the way that God deals with the world. You want to know why bad things happen to good people, and you want to know why God doesn't punish wickedness. It's because he's not judging things in the simplistic manner that we are. God considers all aspects in his supervision and judgment. And so there's an interesting picture we see of that here in chapter 15. So Joshua doesn't launch a campaign against Jerusalem. He chooses peaceful coexistence. And, you know, it's as a practical consideration on a personal applicational level, I wanted to just make a quick comment on this, that as I've grown older, and I think you guys, I'm sure, will relate with what I'm about to say, because all of us here in this class, particularly, none of us are kids. We've all lived some life. We've raised children. We've seen some things. And we find that many times we find ourselves in situations where somebody from the outside of our immediate circumstance could look at what we're doing or the decisions that we're making, and they might think that we are showing a sort of a weakness or a form of compromise, that we're somehow not sticking to our guns about something, and we're allowing something to be that should never be, perhaps. You know, we look at the way other people raise their children, for instance, and we think, why do they let their kids do X? Why don't they come down on them? I would never tolerate that from my children, or what have you. Or, you know, this is one example. Or you might think that, you know, that person says they're observant of Torah, and yet, you know, I've seen some of their posts on social media, and they don't look like they're observing Torah. They look like they're having a good old time for themselves, you know. And it's easy to judge. It's easy to come to snap conclusions. But all we got to do is look at ourselves and realize that there's many times we find ourselves in situations that when somebody else looks at it with a limited perspective, without all the information, they could jump to some pretty faulty conclusions. And it's very hurtful to us, isn't it, when people do that to us, when they jump to conclusions about our circumstances and they make character judgments of us based on things they don't really fully know, and we don't have the opportunity to explain it to them. We don't have the ability, because we must remain silent sometimes and just put up with stuff. We don't have the ability to clear our name. And yet, many times we find ourselves in situations like that where there's a light to heavy consideration. There's a higher priority we're focusing on above and over this small consideration that somebody else thinks is so critical. And so we have to be very, very careful to not judge one another unfavorably, and also not judge ourselves unfavorably, because we can put ourselves under tremendous guilt and strain when we try to judge ourselves based on some idealistic concept that we think we need to be living up to, when in fact we are actually walking in love. We're actually walking in exactly what God wants us to do by compromising in something that somebody else thinks is so vital. But God has you in this place where you know in your heart that the right thing to do is this, and you do it. And people can squawk and say whatever they want. Just make sure that you're not squawking and saying whatever you want to yourself. Don't do lashon hara to yourself. Give yourself a break and recognize that the circumstances that we're in are God ordained, and He wants us to walk through it the best way that we can. And we're going to learn through it, and we're going to become better people through it if we maintain our emunah, we maintain our faith, and we maintain our perspective that God works all things to tov. He is tov. He wants us to experience goodness. He wants us to have the relationship with Him that is based on peace, not based on rancor, and not based on guilt and shame. Shame is a very destructive emotion. When we experience shame, the result is that we want to cover ourselves and we want to run to the darkness, and we do the opposite of what we need to do to be whole. Wholeness comes by basking in the light, not by feeding our shame. Shame is something that is not. Oh, that was my customer messaging me. Shame is something that is not a healthy emotion. In fact, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, one of the key elements of his teachings is to cultivate joy by any means possible. Not by sin, obviously, but Rabbi Nachman stresses that if you're struggling to have joy, to go out of your way to even do something silly that'll put you in a silly frame of mind so that you can experience joy and come out of the doldrums of guilt and shame, because shame and negativity are what kill spiritual connection to God. So we need to cultivate positivity in our spiritual outlook, so that we're not only not judging other people, but let's not judge ourselves. Let's not do lashon hara to ourselves, and let's recognize that we can trust in what God has put in us to sit back and say, okay, legalistically, we have all these things out here that affect me on a public front, but in my heart and in the wisdom that God has given me based on my own study of His Word and my own study of these sources, I know that there's a wisdom that transcends the legalese. There's a wisdom that transcends what others would say. Let me not put myself in the seat of the critic, because as Jerry Garcia said very famously, the critic is always wrong. So we have to cultivate emunah. And I think that's an interesting point. I really wanted to emphasize that, because I think it's fascinating to me how Joshua, in one place, chooses to step on the necks of his enemies and tell his men, don't relent, keep pushing forward, keep going, keep fighting, don't let any of them escape. And yet, on the other hand, he chooses peaceful coexistence with the inhabitants of what's going to become the capital city. You might think, well, why is Joshua so inconsistent? But if we don't have the information that we have before us of the covenant with Abraham and Abimelech, we would be quick to judge Joshua as being kind of weak-kneed and inconsistent, not following through. Why is he suddenly losing courage? Why is he losing his nerve? Well, he's really not in this case. He's actually doing God's will. So it's a very interesting point. So let's move on. We get to chapter 18. We're skipping ahead again a couple of chapters. Like I told you, I'm going to do something I've never done before, which is one of my classmates is messaging me instead of being in class. Hold on, I'm going to give him some heck here. He just missed the best part of the study. Oh well. He'll just continue to walk in shame and self-judgment, I guess. That's okay. So we get to 18. He'll watch this later and be like, hey, what are you talking about? Um, Kevin. Yeah, it's an interesting subject, man. The whole idea of emunah, of not being too self-judging. I mean, it's something I have to really work. I've had so much stress this week, but most of it's all in my mind because I'm freaking out because I want my business to be successful. And you don't realize sometimes when you're putting a lot of eggs in a certain basket, so to speak, when those eggs start to crack and you're like, oh no, it's not going perfectly. And all of a sudden you start to feel this sense of, I've been feeling all week long. I've been feeling uh, a sense of deficiency. I've been feeling like, oh no, I'm not going to succeed. I'm going to fail. My family's going to experience failure. And I've been having this anxiety and I've been feeling mad and angry because I know I'm doing something good and I know I'm doing a quality service and things aren't going the way that I expected them to. And I'm finding myself scrambling, trying to save something and feeling angry at people and feeling resentful and wondering what I did wrong and being mad at myself and beating myself up and people not calling me back and I don't follow through and all these negative thoughts. And it's all Lashon Hara. It's all me beating myself down. And 20 years ago, I'd be like, oh, the enemy is attacking me. It's not the enemy attacking me. I'm the enemy. I'm Satan. I'm the one. My own Yetzer Hara is what's battling against what's good. It's deceiving me. I'm telling myself a story that isn't true. And I'm letting myself get emotionally affected by it. I had to literally, my wife actually was like, stop being negative. And she said that to me, right, hon? And I'm like, how am I being negative? What am I being negative? And she said to me, well, you're dumping all your work stress. I don't need to deal with your work stress. I'm like, I am? And then I had to think about it. I'm like, yeah, I guess I am. I'm like vocalizing my anxiety. And what it does is it transfers the anxiety to other people. And you don't even realize you're doing it. I didn't realize I was doing it. I had to stop and be like, I'm transferring anxiety here. This is what's going on inside my brain. I'm telling myself a story of defeat. And that's what I'm trying to say. That's what I'm trying to communicate is that we can't let circumstances determine our faith. We have to allow ourselves to bask in the knowledge of God's goodness, even when everything is going seemingly to pot. Because you know what happens, right? Is that the moment things start turning around, you realize, oh, what was all that stress about? I was agonizing over nothing because look what happened. We ended up paying the bill. We got this job over here. Yeah, I lost this over here, but I gained this over here. Why am I having anxiety? I would have been a much happier person being happy and joyful through that whole process instead of dumping anxiety and stress on everybody else. And so it's a self-correction thing. We always have this constant battle every day, and everybody goes through it. It's just a matter of how we recognize it. Do we recognize it? Do we have the spiritual consciousness to recognize that we're in a battle? That's the first step. So anyways, Joshua understands some of these dynamics. Of course, I don't know what Joshua was experiencing emotionally or mentally. We only know what he did. And of course, that's a big point too. So moving on here, we get to chapter 18, 1 through 2. I'm going to open my window because I don't have my fan. Somebody hoisted my fan. And so now I'm like bursting with sweat beads. Let me open up my window 1 second. I don't know where my fan went. It usually keeps me going during my class, but I don't have it. So it'll just be another incentive for me to go faster. So chapter 18, 1 through 2. Moving along to that, it says, and the whole congregation, oh, wait a minute, I didn't read all my notes here. Oh, no, I did. Oh, yeah, this is what I missed. Okay, before I go to chapter 18, very interesting, I forgot to mention this, that Jerusalem, the land that Jerusalem is part of the inheritance mostly of Benjamin, but it's shared with Judah. So Judah has, in fact, when you look at the Temple Mount, Judah and Benjamin's property rights, they intersect right at the place where the altar sits. Very, very interesting. I covered this when I studied Exodus. One of the teachings I did in Exodus, I covered this whole thing about the Temple Mount and the intersection of Benjamin and Judah. But I find it interesting. I just wanted to mention that. You remember in the story of Joseph, how when Benjamin comes to the table of Joseph, that he gives Benjamin a fivefold portion. And it's interesting because Benjamin, of course, was the only one of the sons who wasn't, who was actually born in the land of promise. Benjamin was actually born in the land of promise. He wasn't born in the wilderness. And also, Benjamin wasn't party to the conspiracy of the brothers to try to kill Joseph. Benjamin wasn't part of that. So he's innocent of that. And it's interesting that Benjamin receives the fivefold portion at Joseph's table, and he ends up being the one that inherits the city of David, the land that Jerusalem is found in. So the jewel of Zion is the inheritance of Benjamin. It's a very fascinating idea. So anyways, that being covered, we get to chapter 18, verses 1 through 2. And it says, excuse me, and the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. And the land was subdued before them. And there remained among the children of Israel 7 tribes who had not received their inheritance. So, we're here at Shiloh. This is a very significant thing for you guys to know. 7 tribes have not yet received their official inheritance. 5 have. Let's turn to the Talmud again. And we're going to look at a passage that talks about this. So we have to realize some important things. Where is it? I have it here somewhere. Here it is. We're going to go to Zevakim 1:18. We're going to read both from the A side and the B side of a small portion. So it says, the Mishnah teaches that when the people arrived at Shiloh, private altars were prohibited. There was no roof of wood or stone in the tabernacle in Shiloh. There was only a building of stone below, and the curtains of the roof of the tabernacle were spread above it. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, one verse states with regard to Hannah bringing Samuel to the tabernacle, and she brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, 1 Samuel 1:24. And one verse states, and he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent that he had made to dwell among men, Psalm 78:60. And in addition, it is written, moreover, he abhorred the tent of Joseph and chose not the tribe of Ephraim, Psalm 78:67. Well, that's interesting. It says that in the Psalms. Didn't even realize that. One verse describes the tabernacle in Shiloh as a house, while the other describes it as a tent. How can these texts be reconciled? As the Mishnah states, there was no roof of wood or stone there. Rather, there was stone below, and it was therefore described as a house, and the curtains of the tabernacle were spread above it, and it was therefore described as a tent. And the period that the tabernacle was in Shiloh was characterized in the Torah as rest, in the verse which says, for you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God has given you. Now, it's interesting because this concept of the rest of the people of God. In Christian vernacular, this is a huge idea, which is communicated in the book of Hebrews, when it talks in Hebrews chapter 4 and also in Hebrews, I think, chapter 10, without quoting it right in front of me. But there's this concept of Israel in the wilderness not entering into their rest, and yet that rest is portrayed as being Jesus. But the problem with that idea in Hebrews is the fact that it's not true. It's not true that Israel in the wilderness never entered their rest. Now, the generation that perished, which is in truth the context that Hebrews seems to be alluding to, is the idea of the wilderness generation that died. But it kind of twists it a little bit out of context by reattributing the idea to this concept of a coming Christ, coming Messiah, when in fact the rest that's in view, both in the Torah and really in this passage that's quoted by the book of Hebrews, is the idea of Israel entering into its inheritance. That there's a wandering that goes on, and then finally, when there's a settledness, when there's an establishment of the inheritance, what happens is the tabernacle is erected in a permanent location, and that becomes the rest that the Tanakh is speaking of. The rest is a permanent, safe location for the worship of God. That's the rest that we're to enter into. Unfortunately, in Christian terminology, when Christians talk about entering into rest, it's typically in the form of entering into rest from works, rest from obligation, rest from obedience to God, really. But that's a perversion of the idea. The idea in Jewish thought is never to rest from works. It's never a Jewish concept to rest from obedience to God. The rest is a place of settledness, a place of, home. We've made it home. We're not wandering anymore. That's the idea of rest in the Jewish Bible. It's not the idea of an annulment of obligation to do works. That's a blasphemous concept, but that's what's promoted within the church. And it's unfortunate because it's a complete perversion of the idea as found in the Torah. So when we read this in Deuteronomy 12:9, that the rest is the inheritance, it's literally what it says in the verse, not the Talmud, but in the actual Torah, says the rest is the inheritance that the Lord your God has given you. And that's what Zevakim reemphasizes. We move on to the second side of this page in Zevakim. And it says, Rabbi Abahu says that a different biblical allusion may be found in what the verse states in the context of Jacob's blessing to Joseph. Joseph is a fruitful vine by a fountain, ayin, Genesis 49:22. The Gemara interprets the word fountain homiletically. An eye that did not wish to partake or derive benefit from something that was not his, the wife of Potiphar, shall merit to have offerings of lesser sanctity consumed in Shiloh, in Joseph's portion of Eretz Israel, to the fullest extent of its eyes, from wherever Shiloh can be seen. Rabbi Yosei, son of Rabbi Chanina, says that another allusion may be found in the context of Moses' blessing to Joseph, and the goodwill of him who dwelt in the bush. Deuteronomy 33:16, the Gemara interprets the word seneh homiletically. An eye that did not wish to derive benefit from something that was not his shall merit to have offerings of lesser sanctity consumed among the haters. In other words, offerings of lesser sanctity may be consumed in any place that overlooks Shiloh, even in the portions of the other tribes who are described by the Torah as hating Joseph. So it's interesting that, people think that, Israel can't offer sacrifices anymore because the temple is not built. That's actually a reductionism. That's actually not technically true. In fact, today, it's possible to offer sacrifices on the Temple Mount even without the temple. The only thing that's missing is the permission of the authorities. It is possible, for instance, for a priesthood to offer the Passover sacrificial lamb on Passover on the Temple Mount. It would be completely permissible within Torah law. The reason it doesn't happen is they do not have the requisite authority granted to them to do so. And that's what most people don't realize. The presence of the Dome of the Rock is not preventing Jewish worship. It's certainly highly explosive if they were to try to walk it out, and it would result in war. But it's not necessarily impossible. What we see here with Shiloh is that the presence of Shiloh, it wasn't necessarily against the Torah for the people to offer sacrifices to God outside of the temple location unless the temple was accessible. So the sin associated with offering sacrifices today is the sin of offering them in a wrong location when the correct location has been established. That's one of the major issues. Now, one of the things we don't understand, like for instance, when we read the story of Samuel, in the book of Samuel, little boy Samuel, and he's got Eli the priest, and he hears the vision from God, and he goes to Eli, and Eli wants to know what's going on, and eventually, of course, there's a big war, and Eli's sons are wicked, and they lose the ark, and Samuel rises up and becomes a great prophet, and that whole wonderful story. Many people read that, and they envision this all happening in Jerusalem. That didn't happen in Jerusalem. That happened at Shiloh. It didn't happen in Jerusalem. So we see this now. Last thing I want to say about Shiloh on that idea, going back to Benjamin now, is finishing my reading, I have another reading here in Zevakim. Let me finish that. It says, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said, the divine presence rested upon the Jewish people in three places, in Shiloh, and Nov, and Gibeon, and the eternal house, and in all of those the divine presence rested only in the portion of the tribe of Benjamin. As it is stated in Moses' blessing to Benjamin, the beloved of the Lord shall dwell in safety by him. He covers him all the day, and he dwells between his shoulders. Deuteronomy 33:12. Meaning all coverings, times of resting of the divine presence upon the Jewish people shall be in the portion of Benjamin. So where is the portion of Benjamin? Jerusalem. So why is it that the Kotel is so important? Why is it such a powerful experience for people to go to the wall and pray? Why is it such a powerful experience to go to Jerusalem? Because that's the center of where the divine presence rests, in Benjamin. That's why Benjamin receives the fivefold portion. Benjamin receives the blessing of receiving abundance and representation of the Shekinah. And that's a very interesting thing the Talmud speaks of. So it says, until the tabernacle was established, I'm going to go ahead and now give the Talmudic source for what I was just telling you about sacrifices. It says, until the tabernacle was established, private altars were permitted, and the sacrificial service was performed by the firstborn of the family. And from the time that the tabernacle was established, private altars were prohibited, and the sacrificial service was performed only by the priests. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains surrounding the courtyard of the tabernacle in the wilderness, and offerings of lesser sanctity were eaten throughout the camp of Israel. When the Jewish people arrived at Gilgal, private altars were permitted. Offerings of the most sacred order were eaten within the curtains, and offerings of lesser sanctity were eaten anywhere. When they arrived at Shiloh, private altars were prohibited, and there was no roof of wood or stone there in the tabernacle in Shiloh. Rather, there was only a building of stone below, and the curtains of the roof of the tabernacle was spread above it. And the period that the tabernacle was in Shiloh was characterized in the Torah as the rest of the people of God. In the verse, for you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God has given you. Deuteronomy 12:9. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains in the courtyard of the tent of meeting, and offerings of lesser sanctity and second tithe were eaten in any place that overlooks Shiloh. When Shiloh was destroyed, see 1 Samuel 4:18, it's the event I was just talking about, the Jewish people arrived at the tabernacle at Nov and later at Gibeon, and private altars were then permitted. Offerings of the most sacred order were then eaten within the curtains in the courtyard of the tent of meeting, and offerings of lesser sanctity were eaten in all the cities of Eretz Yisrael. So you can understand from this passage in Talmud, I don't know if you guys ever had this experience, but reading through the Bible sometimes, it would always be baffling to me why there were always these high places that the kings had to tear down. Like every single time you had a king that repented and turned back to Torah, he would tear down the high places. And I always thought to myself, what are these high places? Like, don't they have a place for the tabernacle? Like, why are there always these places of worship? Was it that bad? Was pagan worship that bad? Well, no, you understand, right? If you have a series of years, of many years where there's no established place, then people get into a habit and a tradition of going to a certain place to go offer sacrifices, right? And it wouldn't take much time before nobles of the local community would be recognized as, well, he's the one that does it, and this is where we're going to go. And, on every week, on Sabbath, there's an offering or whatever. I mean, you got this practice that can pop up. You got these people that, they don't have internet, they're living off on their own. They're in the land. There's no place to go to make aliyah, to go make the offering, and they develop a habit. And so then when there's something established or reestablished, there's a need to go around and put everything back in order and say, hey, stop doing that over there. Cut that out. We got to do this over here. And so you can see that. So it made a lot more sense to me when I saw this. I realized, oh, okay, well, when you consider this, you can see how, the people lacking organization or lacking structure, they would quickly lapse into pagan practice just because they don't know what else to do. They're just moving forward, This is what happens. It happens in our culture. You look around and, every once in a while, people get this blast of holiness in their consciousness, and they look around at the culture and they're like, how did we get like this? Like, how did this happen? And you realize it's just human nature. What have I said many times? The basic state of mankind is what? Paganism. That's what people are. People are pagans unless they're taught otherwise. So if you leave people alone long enough and they don't have any spiritual refinement, guess what they're going to act like? They're going to act like debauched pagans. That's what happens. That's the way of culture. It's not America. It's just the way the human race is. It's how we are. So anyways, a couple of notes here that needs to be clarified from this passage. Is sacrificial service was performed by the firstborn. I want to explain this a little bit. It says that initially, the Torah states, "Sanctify to me every firstborn," Exodus 13:2. Subsequently, Aaron and his sons were inaugurated into the priesthood with the establishment of the tabernacle. As it is written, "And I have taken the Levites from among the children of Israel, instead of every firstborn that opens the womb among the children of Israel, and the Levites shall be mine." Numbers 3:12. So the Levites replace the firstborn of all the families. That's their function. The sages explain that as a consequence of the firstborns having worshipped the golden calf, the right to perform the service in the tabernacle was taken from them and given to only the priests. This is found in the Jerusalem Talmud in Megillah. A dissenting opinion with regard to this matter is cited in the Gemara in this section of Zevachim in 115b. And then the idea of when they arrived at Gilgal, I mentioned this place Gilgal, where there was another place where the Shekinah dwelt. It says, this is where the people encamped upon their arrival in Eretz Yisrael, and where the tabernacle stood for 14 years. So Joshua leads the people into the land, and for the first 14 years of people's presence in the land, Gilgal is the center of worship. That's where the tabernacle is erected, and it stays there for the first 14 years. I can imagine being part of the generation that enters Eretz Israel for the first time, and they get old, and they're sitting in their living room talking to their own grandkids and saying, "I remember way back when the center of worship was at Gilgal. Those were the days. Those were the good old days when, when things were new and fresh," and they long for those days, even though it was never God's intention for it to stay there. Sometimes this is how we are. We long for things past that are needing to stay past. Like, let's not resurrect the past because God's moved on from that. We're here now, but the way our minds work emotionally, we long to always go back, even if it was bad. We want the leeks and onions of Egypt, even though it was a place of bondage and slavery. We still look back and think, "Oh, things were so nice in Egypt when I had leeks and onions. I wish I was back there." That's how people are. That's how we are. So it says that there was no prohibition against sacrificing outside the tabernacle at this time, as the prohibition is predicated upon the existence of an Israelite camp, as derived from the verse, whatever man of the house of Israel that kills an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, Leviticus 17:3. And, before I studied this, I didn't realize this. I didn't realize that it was based upon the encampment, not upon the physical structure of the tabernacle. That's because that's what I was taught, but that's not the case. There was no Israelite camp during the period of Gilgal because the nation was engaged in conquering and settling the land. For the same reason, offerings of lesser sanctity, which generally are to be eaten in the Israelite camp, could be eaten anywhere. See Rambam's commentary to the Mishnah, and see Rashi. The Tosefta indicates that since at the time of the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, the ark traveled before the people and was not permanently located in the tent of meeting, the tabernacle did not have the status of the tabernacle of the Lord, but of a great public altar. See Ramban on Deuteronomy 10:1 and Zevachim 117b, and the Jerusalem Talmud Megillah, and also Meshech Chokmah on Deuteronomy 12:8. Those are the sources for that. Okay, and lastly, it says when they arrived at Shiloh, after describing the conquest and division of the land, the verse states, "And the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled themselves together at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. And the land was subdued before them," Joshua 18:1. It was there that the ark was located on a permanent basis, and the divine presence was manifest for 369 years at Shiloh. So how many people knew that? How many people knew that the place of the dwelling presence among Israel was Shiloh for almost 370 years? That's 100-something years longer than the United States has existed, to put that in context. So take the entire history of the United States, add 100 years to it, thereabouts, and you've just duplicated the amount of time that Shiloh was the center of Jewish worship. Not Jerusalem, but Shiloh. So we can see how now that we know this information, how when we look at the idea that the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the Philistines who controlled the Tower of David, how they weren't able to be driven out, and Joshua chose to coexist with them. We look at it from our vantage point. We look at Jerusalem. Oh, this is a city of David. How could Joshua compromise? But then we see that it really wasn't a compromise. It was peaceful because they had a place where the divine presence was already dwelling. And it dwelled there for over 360 years. Amazing. The tabernacle of Shiloh was not the portable one that had been utilized in the wilderness. It is referred to as the house of the Lord, 1 Samuel 1:24, and the temple, 1 Samuel 3:3, which is why a lot of Christians read this and they think they're talking about the Jerusalem temple. And it had doors. It was still called the tent of meeting, as we see in 1 Samuel 2:22, and also the tabernacle, which you get this overlapping terminology. In Psalm 78:60, it says, he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent that he had made to dwell among men. So Shiloh is located, and I already explained that, it's because it had walls of stone and it had wooden doors, but it had curtains for a roof. It says Shiloh is located in the hills of Samaria, north of Jerusalem, the Samaritans, right? And archaeological excavations have been undertaken there in recent years. So that's why the Samaritans, and this is true, this is actually accurate, that Samaritan Jews today still do sacrificial system. They still offer sacrifices because according to the Samaritans, Shiloh is the actual place where the worship is supposed to happen. And they reject Jerusalem as the central location. So the Samaritans have no particular issue with the Dome of the Rock being in Jerusalem because they believe Shiloh is where the sacrifices are supposed to be offered anyways. Very interesting, isn't it? So how many of you ever thought of that? I submit that to you for your information so that you understand that dynamic. So anyways, let's move on and wrap the study up here. We're almost done. And it says, I'm going to go all the way to the chapter 19. This is interesting. And the last priest, in case you hadn't figured this out yet, the last priest to, I lost Kevin. The last priest to serve at Shiloh was Eli. So I don't know, Kevin might have lost his internet. Let me just check to see if he's having an issue, because he looks forward to this class. Let's see. Kevin. All right, let's finish it up. So we get to Joshua 19, verse 9. And we're going to, this is going to be the last verse we look at. And it says, out of the lot of the children of Judah was the inheritance of the children of Simeon. For the portion of the children of Judah was too much for them. Therefore the children of Simeon had their inheritance in the midst of their inheritance. Kevin, you got interrupted. All right, no problem. So out of the lot of the children of Judah was the inheritance of the children of Simeon, for the portion of the children of Judah was too much for them. Therefore the children of Simeon had their inheritance in the midst of their inheritance. What does that mean, that the children of Judah was too much for them? Let's look at that. It says Judah conquered much of their land, their inherited land, with the aid of Simeon. We read the book of Judges, we'll see that. Simeon comes to the aid of Judah and helps them conquer. Therefore, Rashi in his commentary states that it's fitting, therefore, that Simeon receive their lot within Judah, because Simeon helped Judah establish it. Now you might think, as I did, that, well, wait a minute now, isn't Simeon an independent tribe of Israel? Why does Simeon have to have the short end of the stick? Why does Simeon have to share Judah's inheritance? Why don't they get their own inheritance? Well, the reason is because of Jacob's curse on Jacob's deathbed. Let's remember what that curse was. Let's turn real quick. I'm going to pull out a Tanakh here, but it's not really a Tanakh. It's actually the New American Standard, which is kind of my go-to when I'm looking for something really quick. So when I get to Genesis 49, I like the way this translation reads. So 49, 5 through 7, and this is Jacob on his deathbed. He says, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are implements of violence. Let my soul not enter into their counsel. Let not my glory be united with their assembly. Because in their anger they slew men, and in their own self-will they lamed oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will disperse them in Jacob, and scatter them in Israel. Now, I think it's fascinating. So Simeon and Levi are the ones who do this, right? This is related to the desecration of their sister Dinah, who was basically raped by the son of Shechem. Was it Shechem himself, or I think it was the son of Shechem, or maybe Shechem was the one that did it. I get the names confused. Anyway, so Dinah got raped, and then the kid falls in love with her, and so they try to make this coalition. They come to Jacob and they make this proposition that, hey, let's let all's well that ends well. Let's just make a truce between our people. You guys have great wealth. You would benefit us, and we can give you freedom to move about the land and enjoy its prosperity. And our wives will marry your men, and your men will marry our wives, and we'll become one people. And so what happens is, Simeon and Levi concoct this strategy where they tell the men of Shechem, well, we'll do this, but only if you all get circumcised. So it's a complete ruse. Jacob doesn't know anything about it. And the men all do this. They all circumcise. And while they're still healing from the pain of their circumcision, Simeon and Levi go in and they just lay waste to the place with the sword. Well, you remember I alluded earlier in the study to this idea that what is the strength of Jacob? The strength of Jacob is study, is proclamation of faith, is prayer. What's the strength of Esau? The strength of Esau is the sword. So what happens when the people of Israel rely upon the strength of Esau is they lose their inheritance if they use that as their strength. You remember last week we talked about how the Torah prohibits a king of Israel from multiplying horses, gold, and women, all emblems of power that people that are in power flaunt. They flaunt their access to women, or men, as it were, to military might and to wealth. And the kings of Israel are prohibited from that. And in the same way, Israel is prohibited from expanding its power through force of arms. It's not its calling. So when Simeon and Levi do this, they bring great shame to Jacob. And what happens is that Simeon and Levi, they don't lose their status as part of the nation, heaven forbid, but what they lose is the inheritance of the land. So they still get to dwell in the land as part of the nation, but they dwell within the inheritance of others. So the Levites are given cities of refuge, and they're given inheritance within each of the tribes, and they're given the service of the tabernacle, but they don't technically receive a portion of the land themselves unto themselves. And in the same way, Simeon does not receive any portion unto himself, but he dwells within the tents of Judah. And why does he get the privilege of dwelling within the tent of Judah? He gets that privilege because he assists Judah in establishing his own inheritance. So that's an allegorical lesson for those who want to draw close to Israel. Hey, Eric, is that those who assist Israel in the Tikkun, they dwell within the tents of Judah. They dwell in the inheritance of the kingly tribe. So, hey, Eric, I'm going to mute you because we got all kinds of stuff going on there. But you can, there we go. So we're wrapping up the study here. I got like 5 minutes to go. So I think that's fascinating that Simeon and Levi don't receive an inheritance the way the other tribes do, but they are within the folds of the rest of the tribes. And Simeon particularly is in Judah. So it's a curse, but the curse has a silver lining to it. So they're not forsaken, even though they did evil. It's an interesting thing. So finally, the last thing I wanted to share is that the Vilna Gaon says that Simeon was given his portion within Judah's territory, while Levi is scattered in many cities within Israel. But in both cases, they provide service to the nation in the midst of that sentence. So just like we saw with Joshua, that he gave a covenant of peace with the Gibeonites, that even though they were relegated as second-class citizens within the nation as servants, yet they didn't get the worst punishment. They weren't made servants of the entire nation, but the Gibeonites were made servants of the tabernacle once the tabernacle was established. So they're given this job of being hewers of wood and drawers of water, but when they get to finally be at the place of their inheritance, it's actually a place of great dignity and service, which is a blessing. And so Vilna Gaon points this out, that Levi was scattered among the nations, not among the nations, among the tribes, but in each place where Levi went, he was of service to the people. He provided a priestly service, and that's an interesting thing. You know, we even see that we read in the story of the books of Samuel. We see evidence that in these various outlying communities that there was always Levites in all these different places, and they were usually many times the priests of the town. So it kind of models the modern synagogue environment, where you have all these synagogues spread everywhere, and you got these little rabbis that oversee these little communities, but ultimately they're all tied together as part of the greater body, no matter what denominational expression they may find themselves in. So that wraps up this study for this week. We covered a blitzkrieg, to quote a term from last week, of 7 chapters in one night, and that's exciting for me. So that we were able to make that kind of progress. So next week, the idea would be to make further progress, hopefully finish the book. If not finish the book, we'll certainly finish it the following week. And then our plan is to have one session with my friend Drake, followed by the renewal of the Derek Hashem study, which I'm very excited about. I've been preparing for 2 weeks now to get back into that. Looking forward to doing it. The pressure is on now, because now I'll be studying with intensity again towards that end. So anyways, thank you for your attention. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Wish you all a peaceful Sabbath, and I can stay on for about approximately 13 minutes. I can stay on only till 9 o'clock tonight. I can't go later than that, but we can have some discussion as I end the recording.